Mike Banning's return came when the U.S. president was attacked, and the bodyguards frantically opened fire while drones exploded directly. A swarm of drones launched a surprise attack, with flames soaring into the sky. It turned out that this was a terrifying assault by suicide drones. That very day, the U.S. president decided to go fishing by the lake, with tight security surrounding the area. However, just when everything was ready, a group of terrorists silently entered the forest by the lake. They calculated the distance and quickly pressed the launch button. In an instant, countless drones like a flock of birds quickly swooped in. Mike, with suspicion, turned around and was shocked to see a dense swarm of drones. The U.S. soldiers immediately became alert, and the security forces urgently opened fire on the drones. However, the drones' speed was too fast, and they used a dense, low-altitude strike tactic, self-destructing with precision explosives. The security team couldn't stop them in time, and with loud explosions, the on-site security forces were gradually taken down. The situation grew increasingly dangerous, and Mike tried his best to fight back with his gun. But strangely, when the drones locked onto him as a target, they immediately circled around and ignored Mike. They then quickly headed toward the president's small boat. In that moment of extreme danger, the security forces hastily pushed the president into the water. They managed to avoid the drone bombing, but they were buried in a sea of flames. Seeing this, Mike, who was nearby, quickly jumped into the water to rescue the president and prepare to escape. However, the terrorists' target was the president. As soon as the two emerged from the water, the drones swiftly arrived. The two had no choice but to dive again. Although they successfully escaped the bombing, when the U.S. military arrived to rescue them, both were seriously injured and unconscious, quickly taken to emergency care. Immediately, news of the U.S. president's attack spread nationwide. The FBI began an urgent investigation into the assault. They quickly sealed off the lake area and combed through every detail at the scene. Unexpectedly, a few agents discovered a vehicle loaded with electronic equipment 2 kilometers away. It seemed this was the launch site for the drones. Meanwhile, Mike gradually regained consciousness after his coma. He painfully opened his eyes and was shocked to find his hands shackled. FBI agent Helen had also arrived at the hospital for questioning. Of the 30 security personnel, Mike was the only survivor. After inspecting the terrorists' vehicle, traces of Mike's DNA were found. His overseas account also suddenly had an additional $10 million US. Listening to Helen recount everything, Mike was completely confused about what was happening. He desperately tried to meet with the president to explain that the real culprit was framing him. However, the agents gave Mike no opportunity to defend himself. They immediately accused him. At that moment, Mike was completely shattered. He was the president's close bodyguard, the most trusted person, and an important figure in the Secret Service. He had risked his life countless times to protect the president, but now he was easily accused of treason. Therefore, Mike not only had to endure the misunderstanding from his colleagues, but he also had to find a way to prove his innocence. Later, under police escort, Mike was taken into a police car for imprisonment. But on the way, the terrorists launched an attack and secretly followed the police car. Using advanced computer technology, they quickly took control of the car's electrical system. The 3 vehicles immediately shut down. The police also noticed something was wrong. Suddenly, a car rushed towards them and slammed into the side. Soon after, the terrorists approached the car door, quickly placed explosives, then unlocked Mike's handcuffs and quickly pulled him back. Not far away in the forest, another terrorist had already dug a hole. Clearly, they intended to frame Mike for the assassination attempt on the president. Mike struggled fiercely and began to wrestle with the terrorists. This was his only chance, and only he could save the president. In the midst of the struggle, the car suddenly crashed into a tree. Fortunately, Mike, sitting in the back seat, was unharmed. The terrorists were quickly subdued by him. To escape as quickly as possible, Mike immediately disassembled the gun and used the parts to unlock his handcuffs and leg restraints. Then, he quickly removed the terrorist's mask to confirm his identity. To his surprise, the terrorist in front of him was someone Mike had met before. It turned out that a month ago, Mike's close friend Wade had opened a mercenary training center. He thought he could make a large profit. However, due to the infamous 2007 incident when Blackwater International, a famous American private military company, opened fire on civilians during the Iraq War, there was widespread international attention. As a result, Wade's mercenary base had lost government contracts. Wade had then asked Mike to intervene with the president to seek business opportunities in the future. However, the newly appointed president was extremely opposed to private military companies. The use of mercenaries would not only cause public criticism, but was also unnecessary for the country to engage in war at that time. At this moment, Mike was furious. He couldn't understand why his close friend would betray him. Was it just because he didn't help him successfully negotiate a deal? Immediately after, Mike grabbed a weapon and quickly fled the scene. The FBI was soon informed about the police car hijacking incident. Seeing the police officers dead and Mike missing, and even worse, based on the investigation into Mike's accounts, the 10 million USD had come from a Russian state bank. Therefore, it was likely that Russia was behind the attack. As a result, Agent Helen urgently ordered that Mike be brought to justice at any cost. At the same time, the leader of the mercenary group, upon hearing that Mike had escaped, sent people to track him down. So, Mike had become completely isolated. Ahead of him was the pursuit of the government, and behind him was the encirclement of the terrorists. Perhaps the only thing awaiting him was a dead end. Soon after, Mike arrived at a gas station and called his wife at home, telling her not to go outside under any circumstances. At the same time, Mike knew that his phone was being tapped. Therefore, he once again informed the FBI that he had been set up and that the terrorists were still planning to assassinate the president. But at that moment, the police suddenly appeared behind him, pointing guns at him. Trapped between two officers, Mike stood still, not daring to make a move. However, in the next moment, Mike swiftly turned around and took them down. He then quickly drove off in a truck, but he hadn't gone far before the FBI, through phone tracking, located his position. Several police cars quickly began chasing the truck. Mike floored the gas pedal, but the weight of the truck was too much. Seeing that he was about to be blocked by a police car in front, Mike sharply turned the steering wheel, causing the truck's cargo to fly off. After shaking off the police, Mike accelerated again to escape, but soon the military sent helicopters to pursue him closely. At this moment, Mike was facing the full force of a nation. As the close bodyguard of the president, the angel protecting the president, Mike was now enduring this kind of treatment. This explained the title of the movie, Angel Has Fallen. Shortly after, Mike sped crazily, but when he took a sharp turn, the truck suddenly crashed into a roadside fence. The vehicle was immediately sent flying. The police cars and helicopters were closing in, but fortunately, Mike wasn't seriously injured. He dragged his tired, injured body and quickly ran into the forest nearby. Meanwhile, the FBI's misunderstanding of Mike only deepened. So, here's a question. If you were in Mike's position, how would you explain yourself? At the same time, the news about Mike's account originating from Russia quickly reached the vice president. While it was possible that the terrorists had exploited a network loophole to alter the information and that Russia's involvement couldn't be confirmed, the vice president acted decisively and immediately decided to take action against Russia. He even called for a press conference, openly stating that he would re-engage with private military companies and insist that Russia must pay the price. At this point, Mike had ventured deep into the forest. But just as he hadn't gone far, he suddenly felt someone behind him. He turned around to see an elderly man holding a Blazer R93 civilian hunting rifle. Despite his trembling hands, his gaze was determined. This man was Mike's father. Since returning from the war, he had suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder and had been hiding deep in the forest, refusing to meet anyone. Even Mike's wife had never met the old man. Therefore, Mike turning to his father was his last resort, the only place he could rely on at that moment. However, the group of terrorist mercenaries, through Mike's computer usage history, quickly tracked down a location. Using his social security number, they discovered that this place was still receiving veteran benefits. After confirming the location, the mercenaries immediately sent people to act. But Mike's father, through surveillance cameras, had already seen the enemy coming. Seeing that they were outnumbered, Mike tried to pull his father away to escape, but the old man directly lifted a floorboard, revealing a long tunnel beneath it. Mike was completely astonished by his father's action. The two of them crawled into the tunnel and successfully emerged outside the cabin. Mike prepared to rise and take a shot from behind, but with a loud explosion, a large number of terrorist mercenaries heard the noise and quickly pursued them. However, the bombs his father had planted throughout the mountain ensured that even if hundreds more enemies arrived, they would be no match.
Stay here.
In the end, after taking care of all the enemies, Mike brought the bodies back into the cabin. He knew the FBI would definitely come to investigate, so he intended to use these bodies to prove his innocence. Soon after, Mike and his father quickly left, and on their drive, he deliberately reported the location of the cabin in the forest to the police through surveillance cameras. Seeing this, the FBI urgently began their investigation. To their surprise, by identifying the bodies, they discovered that these people were from a private military company, part of the mercenary group founded by Mike's friend, Wade. The situation immediately became more complicated. The FBI also realized that something was amiss. Agent Helen quickly decided to urgently investigate this private military group, but little did anyone know, a new danger was about to strike. In another development, the president, still in a coma, finally showed signs of regaining consciousness. This should have been good news, but when Mike learned of the situation, he became frantic with worry. The reason for his panic was that the terrorist mercenaries, knowing that the president had woken up, would definitely attack the hospital again. Therefore, Mike had to stop the terrorists while also dealing with the police pursuit. On top of that, he was concerned for the safety of his wife and child. However, in the end, Mike chose to protect the president and decisively set out to rescue him. At the same time, the old man, after looking at Mike, silently made a decision in his heart. Meanwhile, Wade received a phone call. As Mike had guessed, the enemy demanded that they kill the president. Shock, the mastermind behind this attack was the vice president at the White House. He sought to achieve the highest position, wanting to start a war with Russia and ignite a world war. Immediately after, Wade and his group began preparing to take action. However, the FBI, led by Helen, had already arrived at the location to investigate. But before they could speak, Wade wasted no time and drew his gun. Under Wade's ruthless actions, Helen and her colleagues were killed on the spot, and a terrifying crisis was about to unfold. At once, the terrorists sprang into action. They prepared their weapons and quickly advanced toward the hospital. Mike, however, had already arrived first. Despite the heavy police presence, as the president's close bodyguard, sneaking into the hospital was like child's play for him. Mike quickly changed into a police uniform and used a walkie-talkie to report that a shooter had been spotted on the first floor. As a result, all the police who received the message rushed downstairs. Taking advantage of the chaos and the redirection of their attention, Mike successfully avoided the police and smoothly entered the hospital. It could be said that Mike's role as the president's close bodyguard was truly due to his exceptional skill. Under the immense pressure of being framed and pursued, he kept his composure and logic. Every step he took reflected the professionalism of an elite bodyguard. Immediately after, Mike descended to the basement, where there was only one security officer left. Holding the Coke P-30 in his hand, Mike subdued the hostage and prepared to head to the president's floor. Waiting for the elevator doors to open, all the security staff immediately pointed their guns. The scene turned chaotic, and Mike shouted the name of his friend. Seeing his friend David, Mike finally lowered his weapon, chose to surrender, and spoke frankly that the hospital was in danger and needed to meet the president immediately. At that moment, the president recognized that it was Mike who had arrived. Despite the advice of others, he immediately ordered his subordinates to bring Mike in. The two had a close relationship for many years, and the president knew full well that Mike was not an enemy, while Mike understood the situation. He said directly that they needed to evacuate urgently, and that the identities of the terrorists had been confirmed. Amid the arguments, the president shouted loudly and gave the order to remove Mike's handcuffs, allowing him to take full command. The situation was extremely urgent, and Mike immediately assigned tasks, requesting that a helicopter be ready to evacuate the president. Additionally, all security personnel within the hospital had to be reassigned. Meanwhile, terrorists were closing in, and the situation grew increasingly dangerous. They were forced to wait for the helicopter, but at that moment, the oxygen pipeline in the hospital room began leaking gas. Medical staff quickly inquired about the situation, only to find that the gas system had been compromised. The terrorists wanted to wipe out the entire hospital. At this point, everyone was in a state of utter panic. The security forces quickly moved the president to safety. Chaos erupted within the hospital. But just as the security team was driving the president out of the hospital, the terrorists arrived.
Go! Keep it fast! Joe, gotta move. Go, go, go. Gotta move! We are taking heavy fire on top of the hospital. Keep it fast! All right, let's go. Let's go.
At that moment, the oxygen pipeline that the terrorists had set up was at the point of detonation. massive explosion, a huge column of smoke billowed from the hospital. As soon as the U.S. support forces arrived, the terrorists immediately opened fire, killing everyone in their path. The situation was extremely critical. To protect the president's safety, Mike handed an M4 rifle to David and took a handgun, preparing to go outside and engage the terrorists. The terrorists then stormed the building, and Mike descended to the lower floor to prepare to surround them from behind. They began to raid rooms. It seemed like they were about to reach the final room, where the president was about to be discovered. However, when they opened the door, there was no one inside. Wade, furious, assumed he had been tricked by Mike once again, but he had no idea that the president was actually hiding behind a bookshelf. This was all part of Mike's careful planning. At that moment, U.S. support forces finally arrived, and the terrorists were gradually captured. Wade realized the situation was lost and knew he had to escape quickly. However, Mike kept pursuing him. Wade and his mercenaries quickly boarded the helicopter to flee, but suddenly, one of the grenades Mike had thrown earlier exploded. Wade understood that the situation was now lost. He locked eyes with his old friend, and the two of them began to struggle. Both were elite soldiers, former comrades who had fought side by side. However, in the end, thanks to the protagonist's brilliance, Mike managed to gain the upper hand and fatally stabbed Wade with a knife. The crisis was finally resolved. At the end of the movie, the government dismissed all charges against Mike. Following the detailed investigation by the FBI, the evil vice president was arrested. What awaited him was likely the death penalty, while Mike's father finally got to live peacefully with his family. When Mike arrived at the hospital to save the president, his father recognized Mike's worry for his family. So, when the terrorists arrived at Mike's house to forcibly take his wife and child, the old man stepped in just in time and easily dealt with the two useless thugs. Angel Has Fallen is a tense and gritty action film that focuses on themes of betrayal and the honor of the hero, Mike. The movie successfully creates a heart-pounding chase scenario where Mike is intricately framed by those in power, especially through terrifying drone attacks. A highlight of the film is the psychological depth of Mike and his emotional bond with his veteran father. This emphasizes that loyalty and personal strength are the ultimate weapons for the Angel to overcome collapse. This is an action movie that strikes a great balance between thrilling action scenes and profound political and psychological content. That's the end of today's story. Thank you for watching the film. What did you think of the movie? Please leave your comments below.